So good afternoon, welcome to our last one in the series Living Luke, where we welcome Kate Bruce on the topic, was the tomb really empty? And Liz will introduce Kate in a moment, but before Liz does, please would you like to allow me to say a prayer and join in at the end if you wish to. Almighty God, you called Luke the physician whose praise is in the gospel to be an evangelist and physician of the soul. By the grace of the Spirit, and through the wholesome medicine of the gospel, give your church the same love and power to heal, through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Amen. And so welcome, Kate, and Liz, over to you for introductions.
Okay, I've forgotten how long I've known Kate for. It feels like ages, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. I think when I was first beginning to write about preaching, I remember Kate saying that she wanted to go into bat for preaching, and she makes preaching a real art, and some of the best sermons I've ever heard have come from Kate. She's currently an RAF chaplain living so far east that she's nearly in the sea. She's also a comedian, so last time I saw her in a dog collar was in a pub at the Edinburgh Fringe when she was doing stand-up, and she and I have just published a book together, which she's going to wave, which I waved it last week, which is about some of the women in the Bible, and we intend to complete the other women in the Bible in volume 2.
There you go.
So you're very welcome, Kate, and we look forward to what you're going to say. Thanks.
Okay, great. So the title I've been given is Was the Tomb Really Empty? And before we get into the guts of that, I just want to read the first 12 verses of Luke 24. I've kind of reflected on the whole chapter, but I haven't got time to read 53 verses, and these first verses are the key ones. So let me read them to you. If you have got a Bible, grab hold of it. If you prefer to listen, then listen in. Luke 24 from verse 1. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices they'd prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they didn't find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told this to all the 11 and the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanne, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. So the title I was given, I've amended it slightly. So it's, Was the Tomb Really Empty? Redundant Spices and an Idle Tale. Luke underscores the role of women in the Passion and Resurrection narratives. In a culture which dismissed women as witnesses, Luke comes along and insists that we listen to them. Given that the testimony of a woman was not legally binding in the context, you might think that the women's voices could conveniently and subtly have been airbrushed out. It's hard enough, isn't it, to speak of resurrection without such unreliable witnesses that don't really help the case, or so it would seem. Yet here the women are, first to witness, first to tell the story. Luke is reminding us of the importance of listening to all voices, even those of the ones who are deemed outside the circles of power. They may well be much closer to the truth. So the title, Was the Tomb Really Empty? As a straightforward Orthodox Christian, the answer to me is pretty obvious. Yes. But don't take it from me. Let's dive into Luke's account to explore that very question. As the narrative unfolds, the answer to the question, was the tomb really empty, rather depends on who you ask. There are different people operating in Luke's account. There are the women, the two men in dazzling white, Peter, the 11 and all the rest, and then further on in the chapter we get the two on the Emmaus Road, Cleopas and his mate, and of course the risen Christ himself. Let's focus on the experience of the women. Luke weaves women into his narrative with repeated reference to them. He seems very keen to underline their presence in the Passion narrative. If we did a quick flick back to chapter 23, they get a specific mention in verse 49. As Jesus dies on the cross, we read, all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. These determined women get a special mention. They've stuck with Jesus as he's journeyed to Jerusalem. They've stuck with him through arrest, crucifixion, and they've watched that agonizing journey into death. Verse 55. As Joseph of Arimathea and presumably others take the body from the cross and wrap it in linen and place it in a tomb, we read, the women who'd come with him from Galilee followed. They saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned to prepare spices and ointments. These women keep on following. They're inspirational in their loyalty and commitment. Then in the chapter, the bit I just read to you, chapter 24, verse 1, on the first day of the week at early dawn, they come to the tomb, taking the spices they prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they didn't find a body. And we read a bit further that they're perplexed about this. And then when two men in dazzling white show up, they are terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. When the men later question them and remind them of when the men question them and remind them of Jesus's teaching, they remembered his words. They return to the 11 and all the rest and tell them this. And in verse 10, Luke gives us the names of some of the women: Mary Magdalene, Joanne, the wife of Chuza, Mary, the mother of James, and other unnamed women. And then when they tell the disciples their story, their words are dismissed as an idle tale. Do you notice through the narrative how integral the women are to Luke's account, which should be a great encouragement to any women, and indeed any men, who have ever felt silenced and sidelined in the church? I want us to look more closely at the experience of this cast of women in relation to that question, was the tomb empty? I want us to really get inside their experience and testimony and really listen to them. First question, who are they? Well, Mary Magdalene, we know a lot about her. She's a close companion of Jesus, a fellow traveller. She provided for the disciples from her own resources. She's mentioned in Luke 8, verses 2 to 3, as one of the women who provided financial support. We're told that she had been healed by Jesus. 7 demons had gone out of her. Here is a woman who, however we understand those 7 demons, she's known some suffering. There's no evidence in the gospel that she was a prostitute, although the tradition has supported the idea, particularly in a sermon by Pope Gregory in 581. If you want to read more about that, I can recommend a really good book. My friend Liz Shercliffe wrote about that. However we view her, though, it's indisputable that she was generous. She was a faithful disciple. She was there at the cross and she stayed with her friend to the end and beyond. And that is beyond dispute about Mary Magdalene. Then there's Joanne, the wife of Chuza. He was the guy who managed the household of Herod Antipas. So this is a woman of substance. This is a woman who floats around in the higher echelons of society. And she too is mentioned in Luke 8 as one of the women healed by Jesus who offered resources for his ministry. So we have another generous and faithful disciple who stays with Jesus through the crucifixion, through the burial, and comes back to bring spices to the tomb. So yes, she's certainly well-to-do, but she's not above tending to the dead body of her friend. That's just remarkable, to pause there and ask yourself, hang on a minute, the wife of the guy who ran the household of Herod Antipas went to tend to the dead body of her friend. That seems to me to be quite remarkable. And when you stop to notice it, and sometimes with these narratives, you just kind of float through them and you don't stop and really listen and look. So there's Joanna. And then we get Mary, the mother of James. In some of the traditions, Mary, the mother of James, is identified as Jesus's mother. However we read it, it seems very likely that Jesus's mother would have been there with them as they supported Jesus and each other through the death and into the final rituals of death. It's very unlikely that the woman who was there at the birth was not also there at the bitter, bitter end. And then there are some other unnamed women with them. How many we don't know, but we do know that women were there. Let's try and see the passion narrative through their eyes. These women watched their friend, their brother, their son die a humiliating death in agony. Crucifixion was purposely devised to shame and belittle, to expose, to ridicule. This must have been a profoundly traumatic experience from them all. Just imagine yourself there looking at your friend, your brother, your son. This is immensely shattering. And when the others left, we read that the woman stayed at a distance, the women stayed at a distance, watching, taking it all in, unwilling to leave this special person. They watched when Joseph of Arimathea took the body down. And I couldn't help thinking as I ran it like a film in my head, did they rush to assist? Given that they were planning to go later to the tomb with ointments and spices to touch his body, to anoint his body, they clearly were not afraid of the ritual uncleanness that would come from touching the dead. It seems more than reasonable to infer that they might have reached out and tried to help as Joseph removed the body and wrapped the body up. In fact, when you think about the story, it's obvious to me anyway that as Joseph approached the cross bearing those linen cloths, surely they must have drawn in closer. You just would, wouldn't you? If you were standing there, you wouldn't be at a distance like this. When that moment came, you would have moved in. They would therefore have been in no doubt that Jesus was dead. They were there as the body was laid in a rock-hewn tomb. They saw the death. They saw the burial. They saw the tomb sealed up. They wouldn't have watched the body taken away. They'd have followed. My title is, Was the Tomb Empty? Well, it seems to me that these women would have been in no doubt that the tomb was well and truly occupied, at least on the day of Jesus' death. So was the tomb empty? No, the tomb was full, at least at that point. So the women leave and they make to prepare spices and ointments. And if you get inside the story, ask yourself, as they journeyed away from the tomb, what conversation passed between them? Maybe they were in a shocked and traumatized silence, unable to find language. That's a possible interpretation, and certainly a reaction to extreme trauma is silence. Maybe they talked, maybe they tried to fathom what had happened. No doubt they touched each other. They comforted each other with human touch. Given that they went to prepare spices for the body, they fully expected when they came back that would be a body to anoint. They had no expectation of an empty tomb, no expectation of a physical resurrection, and who can blame them? Yes, Jesus said he would be raised from the dead on the third day, but what would they make of that? I mean, what would you have made of it? We read with hindsight, but they lived as the story unfolded. Maybe they understood his words as a kind of spiritual metaphor. They certainly did not believe it literally, because if they had, they wouldn't have bothered to go home, prepare oils and spices, and come back, because that would have been pointless. They all saw him die. They witnessed the end of their friend's life. So logically speaking, spices were required. So on the day after the Sabbath, they gather their materials and they head for the tomb to anoint the body of their friend. Walk with them in your imagination. That journey to the tomb must have been marked by anticipation of the task ahead and anxiety about how they'd handle it. Just for a moment, but only do this if it's a safe memory. Take yourself back in time to perhaps a funeral years ago. You're waiting for the moment of the funeral. The morning of the funeral comes. Just identify with that kind of anxious, slightly sick feeling that you have in the pit of your stomach as you wait for the car. You've got to do this. How will you do it? How will it be? And that's just in our culture. Well, what was it like for them? They were going along to a tomb with a stone rolled over. How are they going to get in? However familiar they might have been with death, handling the dead body of a friend was always going to be traumatic. So go with them and arrive at the tomb. Presumably, they've worked it out that there are enough of them there to roll the stone back in order to access the body. I mean, I guess that must have been the plan. And consider their shock, their sadness, their grief as they gather to attend to the business of death. The death of the one who'd healed them, loved them, given them significance in a society that did not give women significance. He did. He'd valued them, and he's dead. So they've gathered to do one last thing for him, the thing they can do. They've provided again from their resources, but this time not for food for the living, but unguents for the dead. So stand with them and look at what they see. They expect to see a tomb sealed with a great rock. What they see is the stone removed. Well, what would you think? Has somebody come to anoint the body? Has somebody beaten us to it? Maybe they feel affronted. This was their task. Who's muscled in on their business? When they stepped into the tomb, they must have expected to find somebody already there dealing with the body. But when they went in, they found no one and no body. The tomb in which they'd witnessed a body being placed, the full tomb, if you like, is empty. To answer the question I was posed, was the tomb empty? Undeniable. The tomb was empty. So what's going on here? Luke tells us they were perplexed about this. Hardly surprising. The Greek for perplexed here is a word aporesthai, meaning to have no way out, to be at a loss. If you can do this, and don't do it if it's raw, but if you can, just imagine if you went to lay flowers on a grave, you arrived and you found the grave was open and the body was missing. The grave that you saw backfilled by the grave diggers. I imagine you would be perplexed, shocked, horrified, concerned, anguished, traumatized, and utterly at a loss. There is something profoundly taboo about this, an open grave. Jesus, who'd been taken from them in life, is now taken from them again in death. Double trauma. I picture they just dropped the spices in shock. What do you do with spices when there's no body? They are now redundant spices. So enter two more of the cast, two men in dazzling clothes. Who are they and why are they dazzling? This is not normal. Why do they appear so suddenly? Where the heck have they come from? Luke writes, the women were terrified. Well, it's hardly surprising, isn't it? Faced with men of strange appearance, appearing from nowhere, in a graveyard, in traumatic circumstances, we read the women bow down. I have to say, if I'd have been there, I wouldn't have bowed down. I'd have hit the dust. I'd have been face down in the dust, in fear. The women instinctively recognize that they're in the presence of something bigger than them, something mysterious, something other, something beyond their experience. Do they discern God at work here? Well, they seem to know they're not in Kansas anymore. They are in strange new territory, these women. So what do the two men have to say? Notice that these strange otherworldly men, probably angels, whatever that might mean, stand with them. What does it mean? When was the last time you saw an angel in a graveyard? A real one. Answer. Listen to how they answer the women. The women matter. The men address the women because the women are important. It's important to these strange beings that the women understand and the women remember. They don't just push them aside and rush off to tell the fellas. They stay with the women, and that's important. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, but is risen. What might the women be thinking? What would you be thinking if you were with them? We saw him die. We were looking for the dead among the dead, which is where the dead are to be found. What do you mean, living and risen? The words of the men speak into their internal questioning. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again. Do you remember what he told you? Notice the women were present when Jesus predicted his passion and resurrection. This is not an accidental presence. They are part of the learning community, included in his teaching. These are women who've learned at Jesus's feet, and now they are expected to draw on their learning. Their presence among those Jesus taught was not an accidental happenstance. It mattered that they were there then, so that they could draw on the teaching now. And Luke writes, and they remembered his words. What are they drawing on from their learning? What does it mean, this remembering? What dots are they starting to connect? They are definitely in the process of a growing realization that something monumental has occurred. Number one, they saw Jesus die, plus all that led up to that. They saw his body interred in a tomb. They saw it with their own eyes. They found the stone rolled away. There was no body in the tomb. It was empty. Two strange, dazzling looking fellows turn up. They refer to Jesus as the living, even though the women definitely saw him as one of the dead. They remind the women of Jesus's words about his crucifixion and resurrection on the third day. So, what has happened? Where is he? Could it possibly be true? Could he be alive? Could he be among the living? Could he have been raised from the dead? And the question I think I would have been asking is, if so, where is he? Where is he now? Where has he gone, and how do we find him? Can you feel that bubble of it's excitement, it's bewildered, anxious, incredulous excitement beginning to grow? Can you perceive that as you stand with them? Luke writes, returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to the rest. Now, I don't think that journey from the tomb and the encounter with the dazzling, shiny men back to the 11, slightly less dazzling men, was a gentle stroll. I think they hurried. I think they ran. You would, wouldn't you? You wouldn't just idle along. I think they tore the road up, running with their news, leaving behind their redundant spices. They don't need them anymore. I think they arrived breathless, dishevelled. They tell all this, is the quote, all this to the disciples and the others. I imagine a torrent of words pouring out as they speak over each other and round each other and interject. But their experience is dismissed as an idle tale, and they are disbelieved. Suddenly, all of that excitement, all of that is, I just want to, with my shoulders like that. They've been dismissed and disbelieved. The bubble is well and truly burst, deflated. I wonder what they did next when they were told, you're speaking an idle tale. Did they argue? Did they shut up and doubt themselves? Did they think, did it really happen? Maybe we were looking in the wrong tomb and these were just, sparkling gardeners. Maybe we're in the wrong place. Maybe the dazzling men were just playing games with us, just gaslighting us. Maybe we were wrong. What did the women do then? Did they go home? Maybe one or two noticed Peter herring off and wondered why. Not to be taken seriously when you share your experience is devastating, belittling, patronizing, and hurtful. If your words are just an idle tale, well, what does that make you? You're a fantasist, you're a fool, you're a liar. Their new and growing belief in the reality that the tomb was empty, and maybe, just maybe, he was among the living, has taken something of a kicking at this point. The fire of their faith is doused by disbelief. And in some ways, the disbelief is kind of understandable. I don't want to be too hard on the 11. These women have come with a strange story, probably speaking over each other. It would be easy to dismiss them, wouldn't it? Just to go with, unlikely. I'm sorry, it's just an idle tale. It's the effect of death on them. They'll be fine. They're dismissed. But there's a massive, massive point here that we need to take on board. Let's be very, very, very careful, however reasonable it might seem at first glance, not to dismiss people's stories, however strange they might seem, however shocking or apparently unlikely to us. Because when we disbelieve or dismiss someone, we diminish them as a human being. And it's not too big a step, is it, from that point to making the point that too many children, too many women, too many men have been disbelieved through the history of the church and many societies, often to protect the vested interests of the assumed good people, the assumed people who are in control. We see this time and time and time again in reports on sexual abuse, racial abuse, gender inequality. Listening and really hearing matters so much. It carries such weight, spiritual, political, emotional, and material. To really listen, to really hear someone else is one of the most important sacramental offerings of the church. And there's not many things I'd go to the wall on, but I'd go to the wall on that. The importance of really deeply and profoundly listening is a holy vocation. To be disbelieved is an assault on the self. And when that self has already been assaulted in whatever way, the result is devastating. Anyway, back with St. Luke. Why are the women's words dismissed? Well, is it because they're women and, culturally speaking, unreliable witnesses? Is it because their story just sounds ridiculous? And is it a combination of the two? I suspect it's a combination of the two. But the women's experience teaches us two crucial things. One, never dismiss someone because they belong to a group outside the accepted circles of power. And two, never dismiss a story because it sounds preposterous to our ears. Our ears, all of our ears, we're not neutral, are we? There's no one of us here who listens with neutrality. My ears are not the final arbiters of truth. Our ears are caught up in all the imbalances and institutional power dynamics of our society, of our context, of our church. We're not the final arbiters of truth. Our hearing, like our seeing, can be distorted. And let's face it, we all have blind spots. So whilst it's important always to look again, it's equally important to listen again. Recently, I read a book by Azariah France Williams, just recently out with SCM, great publisher. And the book is called Ghost Ship. I highly recommend it. It's a text which witnesses powerfully to institutional racism in the Church of England, and which gives really good examples, really good contemporary, graspable examples of people not being heard because of race. I think it is essential reading for all of us. It's uncomfortable, but really worth reading. Luke's account of the way the women were dismissed reminds us of the importance of listening deeply and openly to difficult stories, and reminds us that, like the 11, we're not unbiased listeners. Like the 11, we're caught up in societal assumptions about others. The call is to become alert to the bias. After I'd read Ghost Ship, I went on to read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo to try and understand more about how racism touches all of us, and about why white people find racism so difficult to talk about. It's another of my books that are on my essential reading list. It's a book about hearing, really hearing people, and it connects with me to this story in Luke, with the importance of hearing the women. There are plenty of reports of how people have been damaged by not being heard on the issue of sexual abuse in the church. Don't believe me? Well, read the Gibbs report or the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. We must listen and not dismiss. Back in Luke. But isn't it interesting? Not everyone dismisses the women's words. I mean, it would be nice if Peter had had a chat with them before he did a runner, but maybe he did and Luke didn't record it. But anyway, he does listen to them and he acts on it, because he gets up and he runs to the tomb. He goes to see for himself. He embarks on some investigation. He does some homework. He sees the linen cloths and he goes home amazed. He does something in response to the women's words. He acts. He's on the way to believing because he's responded to the women's words, and he goes to see for himself. He listens and he acts in that very Peter-like, impulsive way. Belief in the truth of the empty tomb, and therefore of the risen Christ, dawns in stages. It did for the women. It does for the two on the Emmaus Road a little later on in the chapter. It does for the disciples in the upper room a little further on still, who see the risen Christ, experience terror before Jesus allows them to see and to touch his risen body. So let me draw the threads together. Notice how women are the first witnesses to the resurrection. I'm really interested that the church didn't suppress this. After all, in context, such witnesses were an embarrassment and a potential impediment to this story being believed. I'm so glad they were not airbrushed out. Thank you, Luke. Notice how it might feel to have your words dismissed as an idle tale. Notice how devastating this is to the person telling the story. Are there stories we dismiss without really hearing? Why? What dynamics might be at work here? And notice too, how faith comes in stages and each stage matters. Notice how some stages need a little divine nudge, hence the two dazzling men. Ask yourself, when has God nudged me deeper into faith? I'm so encouraged by those two dazzling, nudgy men, because I see God at work in us as we journey deeper into faith. God doesn't leave us to muddle through alone. God sends agents to help us, to support us, to nudge us. And I find that such a helpful thought. We're not left alone. God is in our story. And notice too how Jesus' later appearances validate the words of the women. Luke reminds us of the importance of listening to all voices, even the ones deemed outside the circles of power. They may well be closer to the truth. They certainly were in this case, because to answer the question I was given in the title, yes, the tomb was really empty. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand over to you. I'm very happy to take any observations, questions, pushbacks. Let's explore furthers. Over to you. I've stunned you into silence, or are you all bored to death? You just put photographs up, haven't you, and got away? Yeah, Liz has just put a photo up. Meanwhile, she's having a gin in the garden. Oh, she'll stop wittering in a minute.
Kate, can I just say thank you for your line that I've heard you say before about listening is a sacrament. I heard you say it at the clergy conference a few years ago, and I've fallen back on it so many times and used it in my own teaching. And I just wanted to say thank you, because it's given me a lot to think about through the years, and I think it's so true. So, most people here have probably heard me say it, actually, so sorry. I did quote you.
Oh, thank you.
Jane's got a question.
Well, it's a proposition, really.
Jane, can you just wave your hand? I can't see you. Where are you? There you are, there in the middle. Yeah.
In the Sue Monk Kid book that I mentioned at the beginning, that Liz recommended last week, she's got, I know it's fiction, but she's got the tomb as being a communal tomb, as being a step up which had to be paid for, rather than the body being thrown into a communal pit, which is where the executed criminals would normally be. And she's got them going into this tomb and not finding Jesus' body, obviously, but there'll be other bodies lying around, and this to me makes sense of they looking for the living among the dead, because there would be other dead in there.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah,
it was interesting, and I've never ever thought of that slant on it at all before. And it just, I mean, I've no problem with the angels, because we see angels in the cathedral, and I've seen angels in the cathedral, so I know lots of other people who have. So if you want to see an angel come into the cathedral, you have to come a lot to spot them. But you know, for them to say, look, he's not dead, you know, he is still with us. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. When my gran, you mentioned thinking back to a significant funeral, when my gran died, my grandfather told us grandchildren, grown-up grandchildren we were, I have to say, Gran's not in that box. There's no Gran in there, but she's still with us. She's in heaven, and she's still with us in spirit. And I thought that was a lovely thing to tell the grandchildren. And I have no problem with Jesus being still with us, but I just do wonder about the physical reality of it.
Mm-hmm. As in the physical, so reading the resurrection as more of a spiritual thing than a physical thing.
The physical body having disappeared. I mean, all our bodies disappear, don't they, in the end? When we die, they all disappear. They all become, you know, atoms eventually. And I just wonder whether, I mean, I struggle with the resurrection less than the conception. But I think we have to, if we're Christians, we have to grasp that there are miracles where the laws of physics are suspended, you know, and if God created the universe, he can decide when to take us out of the rules of the universe. But it was a thought.
It's an interesting thought. For me, the physical resurrection is really, really important. And when I think about why is that so important, it's the image that comes to mind is when in the upper room, forgive me, I can't remember which off the top of my head, which I think it's John, when Thomas says, unless I put my hand, is it John? I'm so rubbish at biblical quotes. Unless I put my hands into the, unless I touch the wounds, there's almost a sense that putting my hand into the wound, I'm not going to believe it. And what really matters to me about the physical resurrection is that that body, that resurrected body, has a hole in it. It's got scars. Why does that matter theologically and pastorally so much to me? Because it says to me that the marks of abuse, the marks of suffering, are not neatly erased out. They're, if you follow through, they're taken up in the resurrection physically into the being of God. Now, clearly, Jane, we're in a world of like mind-boggling mystery here. But just as an idea, for me, it's transformative. And when I listen to the stories around me of abuse and trauma, it is so profoundly pastorally important that Jesus bore those scars and that those scars shaped his resurrection body, because it means that the scars have, that the scars are redeemed. That's what it means. It holds out the possibility for me of redemption as a pastoral and theological idea. So I quite get your thought, you know, of what your grandfather said, that, you know, Gran's still with us. And of course, you know, if we extend that out to the idea of the Holy Spirit still with us, of course, and I have a strong sense of my own dead still in a sense with me. But I wouldn't want that to make me think, oh, well, I don't need the resurrected body, because there's something really important in that. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's kind of weird on Zoom, isn't it? It's like a tumbleweed moment. We're all going, I'm not sure where to look at the moment. Are we?
Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah, Nigel.
Yeah, just a brief aside. Anyone listening to the BBC Northwest News last night would have come across that horrific case of a woman who'd been raped many years ago, an Elvis impersonator, and she wasn't believed. But fortunately, she had the courage to persist and has seen justice, I suppose, served. But what you said about women not being believed, and other vulnerable people not being believed, it just came home so powerfully in the light of that news to me.
Yeah, definitely. I've been following on Twitter the ongoing issues in the Southern Baptist Church in America about abuse, and there's a woman called Lorianne Thompson who has called out, named and shamed. In fact, I think she in the Zacharias one. I get that. So through her, I've kind of got into touch with various people who, you know, it's the same story again. People who have stood up and said, "This happened to me," and then their words have been dismissed and covered up and hidden. And, you know, a story of trauma and abuse just becomes compounded. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that, because Nigel, because it feeds right into a lot of my own thinking at the moment. Yeah.
People have a conception of what an abused person looks like. And I've struggled with that. You know, you can't have been abused because you're wearing Marks and Spencers. You can't have been abused because you live in a big house. You can't have been abused because you've got a degree. You know, I think they have this picture of an abused person who shops in Primark, lives in a council estate, didn't get any GCSEs. You know, and you can't shift that with some people. You know, you really, really cannot, even though you can present them with statistics, but they've got that picture in their head, and that is really, really hard.
It's interesting, isn't it, the things that block people's ears. And it might be to do with preconceived assumptions. It might be to do with it's convenient to have my ears blocked because I hold on to power that way if I don't hear the story. Which is why I think, you know, just to shift it back to that book, Ghost Ship, I think every single person in the Church of England needs to read that book. Sorry, Liz, I'm not pushing our own book here. Of course, you could also read it. Other books are available. But Azariah's book, Ghost Ship, it is profoundly uncomfortable. But thank you, Liz. But I would have said it was one of the most seminally important books I've ever read. And it's launched me into a kind of, we need to read more about this. We need to name our bias, which doesn't mean we're bad people. It means that we come at the world based on all of our experiences. And if we want to be better, I think better people is fair enough. We need to widen our experiences. And how can I widen my experience as a well-educated white middle-class woman? By listening to different voices. So passionate plug for Ghost Ship, but buckle up, because it's really uncomfortable and it will hurt when your ears get unplugged. But once they have been, a whole new world begins to open up. So there you go. I'm not getting any credit for plugging his book, by the way. He's not giving me a cut or anything like that, but I will be phoning him later.
Thanks, Kate. Just one last one from Derek. I think you had your hand up, Derek, did you? And then we'll finish.
I think from what you told me, St. Luke must have been a very stunning and committed person, because he stuck by what the facts and the truth as he saw it, and didn't change anything through a time in history when there must have been a tremendous amount of pressure to rewrite and not to publicize this type of thing to anyone. I think even today we're in a similar situation where there's a lot of pressure, false news and all this sort of thing. People are trying to rewrite and take out things that they don't like about what has happened. But the church has to hang on to the truth of the gospel, the truth of what's happening in our society, and to stick to that truth and make sure that their stories are told, and that it's not smeared over and covered up. Yeah. That's all I want to say.
It just makes me think of what would have happened if the video that woman took of Derek Chauvin with his neck on, I've just forgotten his name, on, help me.
George Floyd. George
Floyd, thank you. With his neck on, kneeling on George Floyd's neck. If that young woman had not taken that video footage, would that story have been airbrushed out?
Oh, yeah.
Almost certainly, I would have thought, without that kind of evidence. Yeah. And for us, St. Luke is the mobile phone footage, isn't he? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think we draw to a close there. Thank you very much for that inspirational talk. I think everybody's written down Ghost Ship, at least, if not a couple of other books you've mentioned. We'll all be on to getting
out of the shadows.
And out the shadows, okay, and that as well, and other ones as well, White Fragility. So thank you very much indeed. This is the last one in Living Luke series. We plan to start again on, I think it's the 27th of September, if that's a Wednesday, I hope it is. And the series will be on the book Being Interrupted by Al Barrett and Ruth Harley. And there were 4 on that, and they were going to have 4 theologies, one on Black theology, one on feminist theology, one on eco-theology, and one on trauma theology. So it's a 4 and a 4, if you like, but it's a total of 8. So it'll take us over the autumn term. Anything to add to that, Liz?
It's the 22nd of
22nd of September, thank you.
Yeah.
If only I could read my writing, it would be good. Thank you. Yeah. So we will look forward to seeing you there. We'll send out the information to everybody, and then you have to respond, and we will send out the Zoom link for you. Same time, still a Wednesdays at 1:10 till 1:50. Thank you very much.
When will we be going back in the cathedral for the Bible talks then?
Well, we might do a mix and match. These will definitely be on Zoom, and I think people who want to sit in the cathedral can do that as well and watch and be with Jen possibly. But we can't be in the cloister room actually until after Christmas because we've got a testing site. So we can't move ourselves back until after that anyway. But meanwhile, we will carry on with these, and hopefully people will value the speakers we get and enjoy listening and learning from them. Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Have a good summer, everybody.